Matteo's thumb brushed the cream from Elara's lip, slow and deliberate, while the food blogger's camera clicked rapid fire. The cafe erupted in delighted whispers. The second the door locked behind the last customer, Elara shoved him away, gasping like she'd been underwater. They weren't married. They weren't even dating. They were two best friends drowning in 6 months of unpaid rent. And this lie, this beautiful, terrible lie, was the only thing keeping their dream alive. But when Matteo looked at her in the dim glow of string lights, his expression didn't match the practiced smile he'd worn all day. How long could she protect her heart when the whole world believed it already belonged to him? Rain hammered against the fogged windows of the daily grind, turning the late afternoon light into something soft and gray. Inside, the cafe was nearly empty, just Mrs. Chen in the corner with her crossword puzzle, and a couple of university students pretending to study while they shared earbuds. Elara stood behind the counter, staring at the spreadsheet open on her laptop, the red numbers seeming to pulse with accusation. She reached for her coffee mug, found it empty, and set it down harder than intended. The sound made Matteo look up from where he was wiping down the espresso machine, his dark hair falling into his eyes the way it always did when he was concentrating. "That bad?" he asked, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had gotten them through the last 10 years. Through her marketing degree, his culinary disasters, 3 failed business partners, and now this. Elara closed the laptop before he could see the exact numbers. 6 months behind on rent. 30 days before their landlord made good on his threats. She'd run the calculations 17 different ways, and they all ended the same. "We need a miracle," she said quietly, "the kind with actual money attached." Matteo dried his hands on his apron, the green one she'd given him for his birthday with "World's Okayest Barista" embroidered across the chest. He moved around the counter with the easy grace of someone who'd navigated this small space for 5 years, set a fresh latte in front of her, foam art shaped like a tiny, imperfect heart. "Then we'll find one. We always do." His optimism should have felt naive, but somehow it never did. Maybe because he backed it up with 4 a.m. shifts and recipe testing until his hands cramped. Maybe because when she'd shown up at his door 3 years ago, crying about her corporate job suffocating her soul, he'd simply said, "Let's open that cafe we always talked about," like it was the easiest decision in the world. The espresso machine hissed, punctuating the silence between them. Outside, London's autumn rain continued its steady drumbeat against glass that needed replacing. Elara wrapped her hands around the warm cup, watching the steam curl upward, and tried to remember what hope felt like. "Table for one?" Elara barely glanced up from restocking napkins when the bell above the door chimed. The rain had brought in a gust of cold air, and a man in an expensive wool coat shaking droplets from a black umbrella with practiced efficiency. "Actually, I'm here for an evaluation." The man's voice carried the particular confidence of someone used to being recognized. "Alexander Wright. The Evening Standard?" The napkin dispenser slipped from Elara's hands, clattering against the counter. Alexander Wright. The Alexander Wright whose restaurant reviews could close establishments or launch them into month-long waiting lists. Matteo appeared at her elbow so quickly she almost jumped, his presence solid and steadying. "Mr. Wright." Matteo extended his hand, his accent half Italian from his mother, half London from his childhood, more pronounced than usual. "Welcome to the daily grind. We weren't expecting—" "I don't do reservations for reviews. Ruins the authenticity." Wright's sharp eyes swept the space, cataloging every detail. The mismatched vintage chairs, the string lights wrapped around exposed pipes, the chalkboard menu in Elara's careful handwriting. "Though I must say, the word about your partnership is quite charming. 10 years together, running a cafe. There's a story in that." Elara felt Matteo go still beside her. 10 years. They'd known each other 10 years. Been best friends for 10 years. Weathered every storm side by side for 10 years. But Wright's tone suggested something else entirely, something neither of them had considered until this exact moment when the word partnership hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer. We, Elara started, but Matteo's hand found hers under the counter, his fingers lacing through hers with the kind of familiarity that came from a decade of casual touches, comfort hugs, falling asleep on each other's couches during movie marathons. His palm was warm, calloused from years of lifting heavy equipment and perfecting his craft. "We make a good team," Matteo said simply, and squeezed her hand once before letting go to reach for a menu. "Let me show you what we've been working on." Wright's expression softened just slightly, enough to make Elara's heart hammer against her ribs. He actually thought they were married, or at least together, and from the way his eyes had lit up at the mention of 10 years, he found that story compelling, newsworthy, the kind of thing that could fill their empty tables and save them from eviction. The lie assembled itself in the space between one breath and the next, in the millisecond before she should have corrected him, should have said, "Actually, we're just friends." But 6 months of unpaid rent sat heavy on her shoulders, and Matteo's optimistic heart drawings in foam wouldn't pay the bills, and maybe, just maybe, this was the miracle they'd been waiting for. She caught Matteo's eye and saw her own desperate calculation reflected back. One look, after 10 years of friendship, was all it took. "We'd love to make you our special," Elara heard herself say, her voice steadier than her pulse. "The one we reserve for anniversaries." Matteo's hands trembled as he reached for the espresso portafilter, the metal cool against his palm, despite the heat radiating from the machine. Anniversaries. Elara had said anniversaries, plural, as if they'd celebrated multiple together as a couple, not as friends splitting a pizza and complaining about their respective disastrous dating lives. "How long have you two been married?" Wright settled onto a stool at the counter, pulling out a slim notebook and an actual fountain pen. "The article mentioned 10 years, but I want to make sure I have the details right." The words stuck in Matteo's throat like ground coffee, refusing to brew into anything coherent. He'd imagined telling Elara he loved her approximately 700 times over the past decade, but never once had those fantasies involved lying to a food critic who could literally save or destroy their livelihoods. His fingers slipped on the grinder, sending espresso dust scattering across the counter. "We've known each other 10 years, Elara said smoothly, appearing at his side with a cloth to wipe up his mess. Her shoulder pressed against his arm as she leaned across to clean, and he caught the familiar scent of her coconut shampoo mixed with cinnamon from the morning's baking. Fell in love over coffee, naturally. Couldn't imagine doing this with anyone else. She looked up at him then, her hazel eyes meeting his with an expression that was part apology, part plea, part something he couldn't quite name. For a second, Matteo forgot about Wright, forgot about the lie, forgot everything except the way her face looked in the warm glow of Edison bulbs, and the truth buried in her words. He really couldn't imagine doing any of this with anyone else. "That's beautiful," Wright said, pen scratching across paper. "And rare. Most couples I meet in this industry are at each other's throats by year 3. There's something special here. I can feel it." Matteo forced his attention back to the espresso machine, dosing, tamping, locking the portafilter with mechanical precision while his mind raced. They could stop this now, laugh it off, correct the misunderstanding, accept whatever review Wright would give based purely on the merit of Matteo's carefully crafted recipes. Take their chances with honesty. Or they could keep going, keep pretending, keep the lights on for 30 more days and hope to God the review was good enough to actually save them. He glanced at Elara again. She'd moved to plate the walnut tart they'd perfected last month, her movements careful and practiced, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept her eyes down, refusing to look at him. She was spiraling. He knew that look. knew she was mentally cataloging all the ways this could explode in their faces. The espresso began to pour, dark and rich, the crema forming perfectly. Matteo watched it fill the cup and made his choice. "She keeps me grounded," he said, directing his words at right, but meaning them for Elara. "I'd be lost without her." Her hands stilled over the dessert plate. When she finally looked up, something in her expression had shifted. Gratitude, maybe, or relief, or the beginning of the same terror he felt building in his chest. "How absolutely lovely," Wright murmured, still writing. "Now about that special drink." 20 minutes later, Elara locked herself in the tiny bathroom at the back of the cafe, gripping the edges of the sink and trying to remember how to breathe like a normal person whose entire future wasn't balanced on a lie she told without thinking. Married. Wright thought they were married. She'd let him think they were married. No, worse. She'd actively encouraged him to think they were married by mentioning anniversaries and special drinks and all the intimate terminology that came with a relationship she'd spent 10 years carefully not having with Matteo. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, showing every worry line that had appeared since they'd signed the lease on this dream that was quickly becoming a nightmare. She'd left a six-figure marketing job for this, burned her safety net for the chance to build something real, something meaningful, something with her best friend who smiled at her like she was worth the risk, even when the math said they were drowning. She splashed cold water on her face, watching droplets fall into the basin. Her reflection looked back, too practical for romance, too cautious for grand gestures, too realistic to believe in fairy tale endings. That's what Mark had said anyway, right before he'd left her for someone more spontaneous. Someone who didn't need spreadsheets and backup plans and 3 different exit strategies before taking a leap. But she'd leaped anyway, hadn't she? Quit her job, invested her savings, and bet everything on the daily grind because Matteo had looked at her with those warm brown eyes and said, "I believe in us." Except us had meant business partners, friends, not whatever story they were now weaving for Wright and the thousands of Evening Standard readers who dissect every detail of their supposed love story. Outside, the espresso machine hissed again, Matteo's way of saying, "Hurry up, we have a food critic to impress." Or maybe it was just the machine being temperamental, which it was approximately 60% of the time, another expense they couldn't afford to fix properly. Elara dried her face with rough paper towels and stared at herself one more time. She could go back out there and tell the truth, confess to the misunderstanding. Watch Wright's expression shift from intrigued to disappointed. Watch him fold up his notebook and leave, probably writing a review about the mediocre coffee and the sad desperation of failed entrepreneurs. Or she could walk back out there, smile at Matteo the way a wife would smile at her husband, and pray they could pull off the performance of their lives. Her hand landed on the door handle. 10 years of friendship, 30 days until eviction, one food critic who believed in their love story. The choice had already been made the moment she'd seen hope light up in Matteo's eyes. "And I distinctly remember the rain on our wedding day," Elara heard herself saying as she returned to the counter, the words flowing easier than they should have. Matteo kept saying it was good luck. The cafe had transformed during her bathroom exile. Mrs. Chen had abandoned her crossword to lean forward conspiratorially. The university students had taken out their earbuds, and 2 new customers had appeared. A young couple who'd clearly been pulled in by the sight of Alexander Wright's notebook. Word traveled fast in their neighborhood. Matteo shot her a look that was equal parts, "Where did you go? And please don't let me drown alone." But his voice stayed steady as he set a beautifully plated dessert in front of Wright. The rain made everything smell like petrichor and espresso. Very romantic, very us. "Petrichor," Wright repeated, pen moving across paper. "Lovely detail. And you chose to open the cafe together rather than pursue separate careers?" The trap laid itself out in front of them, each question a new thread in the web they were weaving. Elara felt Matteo's gaze on her, waiting for her lead on this particular fiction. She moved behind the counter, close enough that their arms brushed, and started wiping down already clean surfaces, something to do with her hands besides shake. Matteo's too talented to waste on corporate kitchen chains, she said, which was true. And I was tired of selling things I didn't believe in. This made sense. We make sense. That last part came out softer than intended, and she felt, more than saw, Matteo's sharp intake of breath. But Wright was nodding, satisfied, already asking about their signature drinks and sourcing philosophy, and all the things they could answer honestly, because at least their coffee was real, even if their relationship wasn't. The afternoon bled into evening, rain continuing its assault on the windows, while they performed their marriage for an audience that grew with each passing hour. Mrs. Chen stayed through her usual departure time, nursing a third cup of chamomile tea. The university students ordered food. The young couple asked if this was that place from Instagram, and took photos of the chalkboard menu. And through it all, Matteo kept finding reasons to touch her. Hand on her lower back as he squeezed past to reach the dishwasher. Fingers brushing hers when they both reached for the same cup. Palm pressing briefly against her shoulder when Wright asked about their most romantic moment in the cafe. Each touch felt like a question. Are we really doing this? Can we pull this off? Do you feel what I feel right now, or am I the only one drowning? By the time Wright finally packed up his notebook, 3 hours had passed, and the daily grind had served more customers than they'd seen all week. The critic paused at the door, umbrella in hand, and smiled at them with something that looked almost paternal. "You two have something special," he said. "The article will run Sunday. I think it's going to change things for you." The bell chimed, the door closed. The last customers trickled out into the London night, still whispering about the adorable couple and their love story cafe. And then it was just the two of them, standing behind the counter in the dim glow of string lights, surrounded by the evidence of their beautiful, terrible lie. Matteo flipped the sign to "closed" with hands that had finally stopped shaking, then turned to find Elara exactly where he'd left her, frozen behind the counter, staring at nothing, her breath coming in shallow bursts that meant she was about 10 seconds from a full panic attack. "Hey!" He crossed to her in 3 strides, caught her cold hands in his. "Look at me. We're okay. We pulled it off. We lied to a journalist." Her voice came out thin and high. "A famous journalist who thinks we're married and is about to publish an article about our fake relationship in one of London's biggest papers. Matteo, what did we just do?" What they'd done was save their cafe, probably. What they'd done was cross a line they couldn't uncross. What they'd done was set themselves up for either the biggest break of their lives or the most spectacular failure. Matteo tightened his grip on her hands, thumbs stroking across her knuckles in the soothing motion that always helped when her anxiety spiraled. "We did what we had to do," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "And now we need rules. Clear boundaries so this doesn't get messy." Elara let out a sound caught between a laugh and a sob. Too late for not messy. But yes, rules. I love rules. She pulled one hand free to press it against her forehead, eyes squeezed shut. "Okay, rule 1. This is temporary, just until the article runs and we get some financial stability back." "Rule 2, Matteo continued, grateful to see color returning to her face. "We keep it professional. Only act like a couple when there's an audience. No blurring the lines when it's just us." The words tasted like ash on his tongue, but he forced them out because this was Elara, and 10 years of friendship meant more than whatever impossible hope kept trying to bloom in his chest during moments like this, when she was standing so close he could count the freckles on her nose and pretend they had a different kind of future. Rule 3. She opened her eyes, Hazel meeting his with an intensity that stole his breath. "If either of us wants to stop, we stop. No questions asked. The friendship comes first. Always." Always, he echoed, and meant it with every atom of his being, even as part of him wondered how you maintained a friendship while pretending to be married, while learning the shape of someone's hand in yours, while memorizing exactly which lies felt close enough to truth that you could almost believe them yourself. Elara extracted her other hand from his grip and moved to start the closing routine, counting the register, wiping down tables, all the familiar rhythms that usually brought comfort. But tonight, everything felt different, charged with the weight of what they'd done and what came next. "We should practice," she said suddenly, not looking at him. "The story. Get it straight so we don't contradict each other when people start asking questions." "You really think people will ask?" She shot him a look that said he was being deliberately naive. Alexander Wright's articles get shared thousands of times. If he writes even half of what he was scribbling in that notebook, we're going to become a thing. The couple who fell in love over coffee and made their dream come true together. Her voice took on a bitter edge. Inspirational, marketable, completely fabricated. Matteo leaned against the counter, watching her scrub the same table for the third time. "What did you tell him about the wedding while I was in the back?" "September 12th, 5 years ago. Small ceremony, very intimate." She paused, brush hovering over wood grain. "I don't know why I picked that date. It just came out. September 12th, the day they'd signed the lease on this place, the day they'd stood in this empty space with its peeling paint and broken fixtures and promised each other they'd make it work. Not a wedding, but a different kind of vow, a different kind of forever. Maybe that's why the lie works so well, because it was built on a foundation of truth." Sunday arrived with the same relentless rain and the Evening Standard article that changed everything. The digital edition went live at 6 a.m. By 6:15, Elara had read it 17 times, each pass making her stomach clench tighter. Wright had written them as a fairy tale, childhood friends who grew into soulmates, who chose love and lattes over corporate safety, whose quiet devotion to each other radiates through every perfectly pulled shot and hand-decorated pastry. There was a photo. Someone from Wright's team must have taken it during the chaos of Thursday evening, capturing the moment when Matteo had been showing her something on his phone, and they'd both been laughing. Her hand on his arm, his head tilted toward hers, the string lights haloing them in warm gold. They looked like the real thing. By 7 a.m., the article had been shared 3,000 times. By 8 a.m., when Matteo arrived to help with opening prep, they had a line out the door. "Holy shit," he breathed, stopping short on the sidewalk, rain soaking through his jacket as he stared at the crowd of people clutching umbrellas and checking their phones. Several looked up when he appeared, recognition sparking across faces. "That's him," a woman near the front pointed. "Matteo, from the article." And then they were clapping, actually clapping, for him standing in the rain looking like a drowned cat, completely unprepared for whatever was happening. Elara appeared at the door, already wearing her apron, her expression caught between terror and exhilaration. "Get in here," she hissed. "We're about to get slammed." The next 3 hours blurred into a caffeinated fever dream, orders flying faster than they could fill them, customers asking for photos, someone wanting to know if they could have their wedding reception in the cafe, a local morning show calling to request an interview, Mrs. Chen in her usual corner, looking smug as if she'd known all along. During a brief lull around 10:30, while Elara handled the register and Matteo restocked pastries, a woman in her 60s approached the counter with a soft smile and knowing eyes. "I wanted to see the kiss," she said simply. "The article mentioned your anniversary tradition, that you always kiss over the counter at 11 a.m., the exact time you opened 5 years ago." Matteo's hand froze halfway to the croissant display. Elara's smile went rigid. "He said that?" Elara's voice came out strangled. "Well, he implied it. Something about small rituals that keep the magic alive." The woman checked her watch. "I've got time to wait. I told my book club about you. We're all romantics. This is exactly the kind of real love story the world needs more of." Behind her, three more customers were nodding eagerly, phones already raised and waiting. Matteo met Elara's panicked gaze across the counter. 11 a.m. was in 20 minutes. They had an audience expecting a show, expecting proof of the love story they'd invented, expecting a kiss that would confirm everything Wright had written about their quiet devotion and perfect partnership. Rule 2 echoed in his head: only act like a couple when there's an audience. Well, they definitely had an audience. "We usually keep it private," Elara tried, but her voice lacked conviction against the hopeful faces staring back at them. "Please?" A younger woman joined in, practically bouncing. "I'm getting married next month and I need to see that this kind of love exists, that choosing someone every day is real." And there it was, the trap they'd built for themselves. They'd sold these people a fantasy, and now the fantasy demanded payment. Matteo looked at Elara, really looked at her, saw the trapped animal panic in her eyes, the white-knuckle grip on the edge of the counter, the rapid pulse visible at her throat, saw his best friend drowning in the consequences of their desperate gamble. He could save her, should save her, tell everyone that they preferred to keep their romance private, deflect with charm and free pastries, maintain the boundaries they'd so carefully drawn 2 nights ago. But the rent was still 6 months overdue. The financial miracle they needed was standing in their café, buying coffee and taking photos, and telling book clubs about the love story that would keep them coming back. 11 a.m., he heard himself say, committing to the lie all over again. Just like always. The minutes crawled. Matteo burned his hand on the steam wand, misdosed 3 shots in a row, and couldn't remember a single order anyone had placed. Across the counter, Elara moved through the motions with mechanical precision, but her eyes kept flicking to the clock. 10:47, 10:51, 10:56, each glance more desperate than the last. At 10:58, she grabbed his wrist as he passed with a tray of dirty dishes. "We don't have to do this," she whispered urgently. "We can say Wright misunderstood, that we're more private than he made us sound." "Elara," he set down the tray, very aware of how many phones were pointed in their direction, how many people were pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. "We're already in it. Might as well commit." Commit to lying? To performing our fake marriage for strangers? To saving what we built? He moved closer, lowering his voice until only she could hear. To keeping this place alive for 30 more days, or 300, or however long it takes to get back on our feet. That's what matters. Not how much he wanted to kiss her. Not how the idea of crossing that final boundary both terrified and thrilled him. Not how he'd imagined their first kiss approximately 1,000 times, but never once like this, with an audience and a deadline and a lie between them. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down, then looked up at him with wide eyes. "The morning show wants us tomorrow. Peak viewing hours. They're calling it London's most romantic café." 10:59. The café had gone quiet. All conversation dropped to anticipatory whispers. Someone's camera flash went off. Mrs. Chen had abandoned her crossword entirely. "It's time," the woman who'd started this said softly, reverently, like she was announcing something sacred. Matteo moved around the counter on autopilot, his heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Elara hadn't moved, still frozen with her phone in her hand, and for one terrible second he thought she might bolt, just turn and run out the back door and leave him alone to explain why the love story was a sham. Then she set down her phone, turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw the same terror he felt, but also something else. Resignation, maybe, or determination, or the beginning of the same dangerous curiosity that kept him awake at night, wondering, what if? "One kiss," she breathed, stepping closer. "Professional, clean, just enough to satisfy them." "Just enough," he agreed, though his hands were already reaching for her face, fingertips brushing her jaw with a tenderness that was anything but professional. Matteo. His name on her lips sounded like a warning and a prayer. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, to laugh it off, to preserve the friendship that meant more than anything else in his world. But she didn't move, just stood there with her eyes wide and her breath catching, and her hands coming up to rest against his chest, right over his heart where it was trying to break through his ribs. The first touch of his lips against hers was gentle, soft, the kind of kiss that promised safety and comfort, and nothing that would complicate the lies they were trying to maintain. But then her fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, and his hands slid into her hair, tilting her head just so, and suddenly there was nothing professional about it at all. She tasted like the vanilla syrup she'd been testing that morning, sweet and familiar, and absolutely devastating. 10 years of wondering, of almost moments in careful distance, of loving her from the safety of friendship, all of it crashing down in the space of a kiss that was supposed to be fake, but felt more real than anything in his entire life. Someone was clapping, several someones, phones clicking, voices sighing with satisfaction, the whole cafe erupting in approval of their performance. Performance. Right, this was a performance. Matteo pulled back, dizzy and disoriented, and saw his own shock mirrored in Elara's expression. Her lips were parted, her cheeks flushed, and she was looking at him like he'd just rearranged her entire understanding of the universe. That was, she started. I know, he cut her off, because he couldn't hear her say it was just acting, that it meant nothing, that they were still just friends who'd simply put on a good show. The woman who'd requested the kiss was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Beautiful, she declared. Just beautiful. I'm bringing my whole book club next week. More applause. More phones. Someone asking if they did this every day. No, definitely no. Never again, because Matteo was pretty sure he'd just shattered Rule 2 into a million irreparable pieces. Through the chaos, a new voice cut through. Excuse me, I need to speak with the owners. A man in a network-branded jacket pushed through the crowd, a cameraman in tow. I'm from Morning London. We'd love to feature you on tomorrow's show, and actually, he looked around at the packed cafe, at the enchanted customers, at Matteo and Elara still standing too close behind the counter. We'd like to do something special. A 3-day documentary series about your love story, full access, behind the scenes. We'll call it Love Brewing. What do you say? Elara's hand found Matteo's, squeezing tight enough to hurt. A documentary, full access, 3 days of cameras following them around, capturing every moment of their fake marriage, exposing every crack in the facade they barely started building. They should say no. Any sane person would say no. But the rent was still due, and their miracle had just gotten bigger. And sometimes drowning people grab whatever flotation device floats by, even when they know it might drag them under. When do you start filming? Elara asked, her voice steady even though her hand was shaking in his. The producer grinned. How about now? The camera crew descended on the daily grind like a caffeine-fueled tornado. 2 lighting technicians repositioned string lights for better ambiance. A sound engineer clipped wireless mics to both their collars. The producer, Marcus, he'd said his name was Marcus, gestured enthusiastically while explaining shot compositions and narrative arcs and how they wanted to capture authentic moments of connection. Elara stood frozen behind the counter, still tasting Matteo on her lips, still feeling the ghost of his hands in her hair, while strangers rearranged their entire lives for better television. So here's the concept, Marcus said, reviewing notes on his tablet. Day 1, we film you working together. The dance behind the counter, the chemistry that makes this place special. Day 2, we go home with you. Show viewers how the romance continues after closing time. He looked up with a bright smile. You do live together, right? Above the cafe or nearby? Matteo's hand found Elara's again under the counter, his grip desperate. They lived 3 blocks apart, had separate flats, separate lives that intersected at work, and Friday movie nights and emergency 3 a.m. phone calls when one of them couldn't sleep. Elara started, but her mind was already racing ahead, calculating. They'd lied about being married. They just kissed in front of 50 people. What was one more fabrication in service of keeping this miracle alive? The flat above the café, Matteo said smoothly, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in what might have been reassurance or panic. We converted it when we opened, more convenient for early mornings. The lie came so easily now, too easily. Elara looked at him and saw her own fear reflected back, but also something fiercer, determination. They'd started this, they had to see it through. Perfect, Marcus clapped his hands. We'll need to film up there today, get some establishing shots. Maybe you two getting ready in the morning, that sort of thing. Very intimate, very real. Very fake, Elara thought. Very, very fake. But she smiled anyway, squeezed Matteo's hand back and said, "Of course, whatever you need." 2 hours later, Matteo stood in the middle of his actual flat, 3 blocks from the cafe, throwing clothes into a duffel bag while his mind spun in increasingly panicked circles. They were doing this. They were actually doing this. Moving in together, pretending to share a life they'd carefully kept separate for a decade. He grabbed his toothbrush, his razor, the cologne Elara had given him last Christmas that he only wore on days he knew he'd see her. Each item felt weighted with significance, like he was packing for a trip he'd never return from. His phone buzzed. Elara. How much stuff? They want lived in, but not cluttered. He typed back. Bringing essentials. You? Already there. Matteo, the flat is tiny. 1 bedroom. Where are we supposed to? She didn't finish the thought. Didn't need to. The flat above the daily grind had been designed as emergency accommodation, not a home. 500 square feet, most of it taken up by the kitchenette they never used, and the bathroom with pipes that groaned at 3 a.m. And yes, 1 bedroom, 1 bed. His phone rang. We can't share a bed, Elara said without preamble, her voice pitched high with stress. That's crossing a line. That's too far. I'll take the couch, Matteo said automatically, zipping the duffel with more force than necessary. Or we tell them one of us has back problems, needs a firm surface, doctor's orders. God, we're the worst liars. He heard her moving around, the creak of floorboards he knew intimately from the few times they'd used the space for storage. How did we think we could pull this off? We can't even figure out sleeping arrangements without having a crisis. Hey, he softened his voice, switching to the tone he used when her anxiety spiraled too far. We've handled worse than this. Remember when we accidentally locked ourselves in the walk-in freezer? That's not the same. That was the health inspector's visit, the time we both got food poisoning the same day and had to run the cafe anyway. Elara, we've been through hell together. We can survive 3 days of cameras. Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, what if I can't stop thinking about the kiss? Matteo's heart stopped, restarted, tried to climb out of his chest. What? Nothing, forget it. Just hurry up, Marcus wants to start filming in 20 minutes. She hung up before he could respond, before he could ask what she meant, before he could confess that he hadn't stopped thinking about it either, that the taste of her was burned into his memory, and he was terrified he'd never be able to go back to before. He stared at his phone, at his half-packed bag, at his reflection in the mirror, same dark hair falling into his eyes, same face he'd worn for 28 years. But somehow everything felt different now, shifted, like he'd stepped through a door and found himself in a parallel universe where he got to pretend Elara was his. 3 days. They had to survive 3 days. Matteo grabbed his bag and headed for the door, trying not to think about how much he wanted those 3 days to never end. The flat above the daily grind was exactly as awful as Elara remembered. Exposed brick that looked charming in theory, but radiated cold in practice. A kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge. Windows that faced the alley and let in the perpetual sound of rain on metal dumpsters. And the bedroom. God, the bedroom was barely big enough for the queen-size bed they'd shoved in there 3 years ago and never used. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, while the lighting crew set up equipment around her. Someone had made an attempt at domesticity. There were sheets on the bed now, clean ones from the cafe's linen service, a lamp on the makeshift nightstand, even a few decorative pillows that definitely hadn't been there this morning. "We're creating the story of your life together," a production assistant explained, hanging photos on the wall, stock images of couples on beaches, in front of monuments, doing normal couple things that Elara and Matteo had never done. Small touches that tell viewers who you are, who they were. Liars, frauds, two best friends so desperate to save their business that they'd agreed to live a fiction for public consumption. Footsteps on the stairs. Matteo appeared in the doorway, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and stopped dead when he saw the bedroom setup. His eyes met hers across the artificial domesticity, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe, of just how far they'd fallen down this rabbit hole. "Cozy," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "It's a nightmare," she whispered back. "They put up fake photos of us. Look, that's supposedly us in Paris. I've never been to Paris." "Neither have I." He set down his bag, moved closer to examine the wall. "Though you do look good in a beret, fake you does." Despite everything, she almost smiled. "Focus, we need to establish boundaries before the cameras start rolling." Matteo turned to face her fully, and she was suddenly very aware of how small the space was, how close he was standing, how the bedroom felt impossibly intimate, even with crew members moving around downstairs. "What kind of boundaries?" "Physical ones." She kept her voice low. "The kiss that was for the show, for the audience. But here, when we're alone, we're never going to be alone. Not for 3 days. That's the whole point." He gestured toward the bedroom. "They want authentic couple behavior, Elara. That means—" "I know what it means." Her stomach twisted. "Casual touches, comfortable proximity, acting like we've shared this space for years instead of hours." "We can do that." He said it with more confidence than she felt. "We're already comfortable with each other. This is just an extension." An extension, right. An extension of 10 years of carefully maintained boundaries, of touches that never lingered too long, of feelings ruthlessly compartmentalized in the name of preserving friendship. Now they were supposed to erase all of that for the cameras, pretend those boundaries had never existed. Marcus's voice echoed up the stairs. "Ready for you too. We want to catch you settling in, making the space yours." Matteo offered his hand. After a moment, Elara took it, let him pull her toward the stairs, toward the cameras, toward 3 days of pretending this tiny, cold flat was home, and the man beside her was more than just her best friend. The worst part was how easy it felt to hold his hand. How natural. How much like coming home. "So talk us through a typical morning," Marcus said from behind the camera, his voice bright with enthusiasm that made Elara want to scream. "How do you two navigate the space? What's your routine?" It was 10 p.m. They'd been filming for 8 hours straight. The cafe had finally closed. The last customer ushered out with promises of returning tomorrow to see more of the love story in action. Now they were supposed to demonstrate their non-existent morning routine for a crew of 5 strangers. Elara stood in the kitchenette, staring at the hot plate like it might offer answers. Matteo leaned against the counter beside her, close enough that their arms touched. Casual contact that the cameras would read as comfortable familiarity, but felt like electricity against her skin. "I usually wake up first," she improvised, opening cabinets at random. "Make coffee. Matteo's not human until caffeine." "Hey," he bumped her shoulder gently, playing along. "That's accurate, but rude." "Then you take forever in the shower," she continued, warming to the fiction. Use all the hot water. I've learned to go second, or freeze. In my defense, I'm tall. It takes longer to rinse. The banter came easily, too easily. They'd done this dance for years, trading jabs and jokes, finishing each other's sentences. But now there was subtext to everything. Layers the cameras were capturing that she wasn't sure they could edit out later. And then what? Marcus pressed. You get ready together? Separate? The trap closed. Elara felt it, saw Matteo feel it too in the way his posture shifted. Getting ready together implied an intimacy they hadn't planned for, a comfort level that required practice and familiarity with each other's bodies, each other's space. Together, Matteo said, his voice steady even as his fingers found hers under the counter, squeezing once. We've been doing this long enough that we don't get in each other's way. It's like choreography. Show us, Marcus said immediately. Pretend it's tomorrow morning. Show us your choreography. No, absolutely not. They couldn't. But Matteo was already moving, pulling her gently toward the bathroom, and what choice did she have but to follow? The crew repositioned, cameras trained on the doorway, and suddenly they were standing in a space barely big enough for one person, definitely not meant for two. Okay, Elara breathed, trying to think. You brush your teeth first while I… Wash your face, Matteo finished, already reaching for a toothbrush that had appeared sometime in the last 8 hours, probably supplied by the ever-efficient production assistants who were determined to craft their perfect love story. They moved around each other in the cramped space, shoulders brushing, hands grazing, finding a rhythm that should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. She washed her face while he brushed his teeth. He reached past her for the towel while she applied moisturizer. Small, domestic movements that felt more intimate than the kiss had, more real than any of the lies they'd told. Hair, she said, catching his eye in the mirror. You always do that thing where… She reached up without thinking, fingers sliding into his hair to push it back from his forehead the way he usually wore it. But this close, with the cameras watching, with 3 days of pretending ahead of them, the gesture felt different. Her hand lingered. His breath caught. For 5 seconds that stretched into infinity, they just looked at each other in the mirror, frozen in a moment that wasn't entirely acting. Perfect, Marcus called from the doorway. That's exactly the kind of intimacy we want. The small touches, the familiar gestures. This is beautiful, you two. Elara dropped her hand like she'd been burned, stepped back, put necessary space between them, even though the bathroom barely allowed for it. I think that's enough for tonight. We're exhausted. Of course, Marcus checked his watch. We'll wrap here. Tomorrow we start at 6 a.m. Catch you waking up. Real morning routine, not performed. Real morning routine, in that bed upstairs, together. They hadn't discussed sleeping arrangements beyond Matteo's promise to take the couch. But there was no couch in the tiny flat, just that queen bed with its crisp white sheets and decorative pillows, and cameras that would be there at 6 a.m., expecting to find them emerging from a shared night. After the crew finally left, after they'd locked the door and climbed the stairs to the flat that was somehow both refuge and trap, Elara stood in the middle of the bedroom and felt the weight of their situation settle over her like a physical thing. I can sleep on the floor, Matteo offered quietly. With blankets, it'll be fine. You're 6'2". The floor will destroy your back and then you'll be useless in the cafe tomorrow. She stared at the bed. We're adults. We can share a bed for 3 nights. It doesn't mean anything. Except it did. It meant everything. It meant crossing every line they'd drawn, sleeping beside someone she'd wanted for longer than she'd ever admitted, pretending it was normal and platonic and just part of the show. Elara, his voice was soft, careful. If this is too much, it's not. She cut him off before he could offer her an escape she couldn't afford to take. We're in this now, all in. We just have to remember it's temporary. Temporary. 3 days. 72 hours of playing house, and then they could go back to their separate flats, separate lives, separate, carefully maintained distance. She repeated it like a mantra while they got ready for bed, while they lay down on opposite sides of the mattress with a canyon of space between them, while she stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about how good he smelled, or how warm he was, or how desperately she wanted to close that distance and discover what would happen if they stopped pretending for even 5 minutes. Matteo's breathing evened out after what felt like hours. Elara lay awake beside him, counting the cracks in the ceiling, and wondered how you survived wanting something you could never let yourself have. Morning arrived with camera lenses and artificial lighting, and Marcus's cheerful voice calling from downstairs. "Rise and shine, lovebirds. We're coming up in 5. Elara bolted upright, disoriented by unfamiliar walls and the weight against her back, and, oh God. Sometime during the night, the canyon between them had disappeared. Matteo was curved around her, his arm draped over her waist, his face buried in her hair, their bodies fitted together like puzzle pieces that had finally found their match. She should move, wake him, establish distance before the cameras arrived. But his arm tightened around her, and he made a sound, soft, content, half asleep. And she let herself have 5 more seconds of this. 5 seconds where she didn't have to think about lies or consequences or how catastrophically she was failing at keeping her heart safe. "Matteo," she whispered, "they're coming." He stirred, his hand sliding up from her waist to her shoulder, pulling her impossibly closer before consciousness fully returned. Then he went rigid. Shit. Yeah. They separated like teenagers caught by parents, scrambling to opposite sides of the bed just as footsteps sounded on the stairs. Marcus appeared with a camera crew in tow, all bright smiles and morning energy that made Elara want to commit violence. "Good morning, don't mind us. Just getting some natural footage. Pretend we're not here." Pretend they weren't there. While cameras cataloged every sleep-mussed hair and rumpled sheet, while the evidence of their nighttime migration toward each other was caught in high definition. Matteo recovered first, his training as a performer, because that's what this was now, a performance, kicking in. He stretched, all casual grace, then looked at her with an expression so soft it made her chest ache. "Morning, love." Love. He'd never called her that before. It was for the cameras, obviously, part of the act, but it landed like a physical blow anyway. "Morning," she managed, her voice rough from sleep and proximity and the memory of waking in his arms. "I'll make coffee," he said, swinging his legs out of bed. "You want first shower today?" The choreography they'd pretended to have last night was becoming real, routines establishing themselves through necessity and 24 hours of forced proximity. She nodded, grabbed clothes from the duffel she hadn't unpacked, and escaped to the bathroom before the cameras could catch whatever her face was doing. Under the spray of lukewarm water, he'd been right about the hot water situation, even if it was the first time they'd actually tested it. Elara pressed her forehead against the tile and tried to remember why they were doing this. The rent, the cafe, the dream they'd built together. Those were good reasons, solid reasons, but they didn't explain why her heart had stuttered when he called her love. Why waking up in his arms had felt like the most natural thing in the world. Why the idea of only 3 days of this felt both far too long and nowhere near enough. She emerged from the shower to find him in the kitchenette, actually making coffee on the inadequate hot plate, shirtless because apparently he'd forgotten that minor detail in his rush to play the devoted husband. The cameras loved it, of course, loved the way morning light caught on his shoulders, the casual domesticity of him navigating their tiny space, the intimate knowledge that let him prepare her coffee exactly the way she preferred it. Here, he handed her a mug, their fingers brushing. His hair was still a mess from sleep, sticking up in ways that made her want to smooth it down again, like she had in the bathroom last night. "I figured out the hot plate. We might actually survive up here." "Might," she echoed, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic and letting the familiar ritual ground her. They had 2 more days of this. 2 more nights of sharing that bed. 2 more mornings of cameras cataloging their invented intimacy. 48 more hours of blurring lines that had never been as solid as she'd pretended. The worst part wasn't the lying, it was how good the truth of them felt underneath it all. By noon, the daily grind was packed beyond capacity. Every table filled, people standing along the walls, a line out the door that stretched halfway down the block. The documentary crew captured it all, the rush, the chaos, the way Matteo and Elara moved behind the counter like they shared a single mind. And maybe they did. Matteo had always been able to anticipate her next move, reach for the milk steamer at the exact moment she needed it, plate the pastries she'd been about to call out. 10 years of friendship had created a synchronization that no amount of acting could fake. "Cappuccino for Sarah," Elara called, sliding the cup across the counter. Matteo was already starting the next order, his hands steady on the portafilter, despite the lack of sleep and the constant pressure of cameras. This was his element, the rush, the precision, the artistry of creating something perfect under pressure. He'd always been better with his hands than his words, better at expressing things through foam art and carefully balanced flavors than with actual conversations about feelings. Like the fact that he'd woken up with her in his arms, and for 5 blissful seconds before consciousness returned, he'd felt complete, whole, like every missing piece had finally clicked into place. "Matteo," her voice cut through his thoughts, "2 macchiatos, 1 vanilla latte." On it, he forced his focus back to the machine, to the familiar motions that usually brought comfort, but today only reminded him of how little control he had over anything anymore. They'd crossed so many lines in 24 hours, shared a bed, woken up tangled together, performed morning routines that felt more intimate than any kiss. And now they were here, in front of cameras and customers, pretending it was all normal. Pretending they hadn't fundamentally altered something between them that could never be put back the way it was. "You two are incredible together," a customer gushed, phone already out to capture the moment. "The way you move, it's like watching a dance." It was a dance, one they'd been practicing for a decade, steps memorized and perfected, rhythm internalized until it was instinct. Adding romance to that equation should have felt awkward, should have disrupted the flow. Instead, it felt like permission. Permission to let his hand linger on her lower back when he moved past. Permission to lean in close when showing her something on his phone, close enough that her hair brushed his cheek. Permission to look at her the way he'd wanted to for years, like she was the entire reason for his existence, and have it be part of the show rather than a confession he couldn't take back. "Order for Marcus." Elara handed the producer his third coffee of the day. "So how's the footage looking?" "Phenomenal," Marcus beamed. "The chemistry between you two is off the charts. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it. The way you anticipate each other, the small touches, the looks, it's magic." Magic. Matteo caught Elara's eye across the counter and saw his own panic reflected back. Because if it looked like magic to the cameras, what did that mean for them? For the friendship they were supposed to be protecting? For the carefully constructed boundaries that were crumbling more with each passing hour? "We should do a testimonial," Marcus continued, oblivious to the crisis unfolding between them. "Each of you talking about the other. What made you fall in love? What keeps you together? That sort of thing." "Now?" Elara's voice pitched slightly higher. "During the afternoon lull, say 3 p.m., we'll film you separately, get those candid confessions that really make viewers connect with your story. Candid confessions about falling in love, while cameras documented every micro-expression, every tell, every truth that threatened to slip through the cracks of their increasingly fragile fiction." Matteo met Elara's gaze and saw the same question. How much truth could they tell before it stopped being acting? At 3 p.m., they closed the cafe for an hour, a luxury they couldn't usually afford, but that Marcus had insisted upon for authentic interviews. The crew set up 2 chairs in the corner by the window, string lights providing soft, flattering illumination. Rain continued its steady assault on the glass, turning the afternoon gray and intimate. "Ladies first," Marcus said, gesturing Elara toward the chair, while Matteo was ushered upstairs, out of earshot. "Just relax. Talk to me like we're friends. Tell me about Matteo." The camera's red light blinked on. Elara smoothed her hands over her jeans, buying time, searching for the right balance of truth in fiction. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with how you met." That at least was easy, safe. "First year of university, I was in the library panicking over an economics paper. He sat down across from me with a thermos of the worst coffee I've ever tasted, made in his dorm on some terrible hot plate, and said, 'You look like you need this more than I do.' I told him it was poison. He laughed and said, 'Then I guess I better learn to make better coffee if I want to impress you.'" The memory was sharp, vivid, one she'd replayed countless times over the years. The way his smile had transformed his entire face. How he'd stayed with her for 6 hours, helping with her paper even though they'd been strangers, like kindness was just his default setting. And did he learn to make better coffee? "The best I've ever had." The words came out softer than intended, weighted with more truth than she'd meant to give. Matteo's the kind of person who commits fully to everything. When he cares about something, he masters it, whether it's espresso or pastry making or loving someone. She'd been about to say, or loving someone, because she'd watched him do it for years with friends, with his family, with the dream they'd built together. Full commitment, no half measures, all in. "Or," Marcus prompted, "or this cafe," safe territory. He poured everything into making this place work. Early mornings, late nights, perfecting recipes until his hands cramped. I don't think most people understand how much skill goes into a perfect cappuccino, how much artistry, but Matteo does. He treats every cup like it matters. "Because it does matter," Marcus said gently. "Because the people drinking it matter." Exactly. She looked out the window at the rain, at the street where people hurried past with umbrellas, oblivious to the little haven Matteo had created. He makes people feel seen, valued, like they're worth the extra effort. "Is that what made you fall in love with him?" The question landed like a stone in water, ripples spreading outward to touch every careful lie they'd constructed. Elara opened her mouth to deliver whatever answer would serve the narrative, and found she couldn't do it, couldn't cheapen what Matteo actually was by reducing it to a soundbite. "I don't think there was a single moment," she heard herself say. "It was 1,000 small things. The way he always knows when I'm spiraling and brings me tea without asking. How he laughs at terrible puns and defends them like they're high art. The fact that when everything fell apart, my job, my plans, everything I thought I wanted, he just said, 'Then let's build something new,' like it was that simple." And was it that simple? "No," a laugh escaped, slightly bitter. "Nothing about this has been simple. The cafe nearly broke us a dozen times. There were days we couldn't pay rent, days we fought about everything from menu items to music choices, days I was convinced we'd made a catastrophic mistake." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But Matteo never gave up. On the cafe, on me, on us, on us." The words hung in the air, true in ways that had nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with partnership, with chosen family, with 10 years of showing up for each other, even when it was hard. "That's beautiful," Marcus said softly. "Do you tell him that? How much he means to you?" She stopped. When was the last time she'd actually told Matteo what he meant to her? Not in the casual shorthand of long friendship, but really told him? "I should." More than I do. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Questions about their wedding day that never happened, their future plans that were entirely fabricated, the small domestic moments that made their relationship work. Elara navigated it all with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 10 years in marketing, selling stories and creating narratives. But that one answer kept echoing in her head. I should tell him more than I do. Maybe that was the real danger of this whole situation. Not that they'd get caught in the lie, but that the lie would force them to speak truths they'd been avoiding for years. Matteo took the chair, still warm from Elara's presence, and tried not to think about what she'd said to the cameras, what truths she'd told, what fictions she'd spun, how much of her actual heart she'd revealed while he'd been pacing upstairs, unable to hear but imagining everything. Your turn, Marcus said with that same encouraging smile. Tell me about Elara. Where to start? How did you summarize someone who'd been woven into the fabric of your entire adult life? Who knew every terrible secret and embarrassing moment and still chose to stand beside you? She's brilliant, Matteo said, because that was the easiest truth. Not just smart, brilliant. The way she sees patterns, makes connections, turns problems into solutions. When we opened this place, I had the recipes and the passion, but Elara had the actual plan. The business model, the marketing strategy, the systems that kept us from drowning in our first month. So she's the brains and you're the talent? No. The correction came out sharper than intended. She's also talented, incredibly talented. She designed this entire space, chose every piece of furniture, created the aesthetic that makes people want to stay. She writes the menu descriptions that make a simple latte sound like poetry. She doesn't see it in herself, doesn't give herself credit. Marcus leaned forward. Why do you think that is? Because she'd been told by people who didn't deserve her that she wasn't enough, that she was too practical, too cautious, not spontaneous enough for grand romance. Because she measured her worth in spreadsheets and stability instead of recognizing that those things were their own kind of magic. Past relationships, maybe. People who didn't appreciate what they had. Matteo kept his voice carefully neutral, but the memory of her crying on his couch 3 years ago still made him want to punch walls. She gave everything to someone who wanted her to be less herself, and when she finally walked away, she convinced herself it was a failure instead of the bravest thing she'd ever done. But you saw her differently. Always. The word came out raw, honest in ways he hadn't meant to be. From that first day in the library, I saw her, really saw her. The way she attacks problems with this fierce determination. How she cares so deeply about things, but tries to hide it behind logic and planning. The fact that she'll work herself into exhaustion for people she loves, but won't ask for help even when she's drowning. He was saying too much, revealing too much. But the cameras kept rolling and Marcus kept nodding encouragingly, and 10 years of feelings were trying to force their way out through the cracks. When did you know you were in love with her? The question he'd been dreading, the one that required a lie, but deserved the truth. I've known for so long I can't remember when it started. That was safe enough, vague enough, could mean anything. But there was this moment, maybe 2 years after we met, when she showed up at my flat at 2 a.m. She'd been at a party, had too much to drink, and instead of calling a taxi, she called me. When I got there, she was sitting on the curb in heels that were probably destroying her feet, and she looked up at me and said, "I knew you'd come." The memory was crystalline, preserved in perfect detail. Her ruined makeup, the way she'd leaned against him the whole drive home, how she'd fallen asleep on his couch and he'd stayed awake watching her, terrified by the force of what he felt. That's when I knew, he continued quietly, that she trusted me, that out of everyone in her life, I was the one she called. And I thought that was enough. Just being her person, just getting to be the one she trusted with her worst moments. But it wasn't enough? No, it was never enough. Every time she dated someone else, every relationship that had crashed and burned, He'd wanted to tell her the truth, that she deserved someone who saw her the way he did, that the right person would never ask her to be less practical, less careful, less herself, that he'd been right there all along, waiting. "Sometimes I wonder if we wasted time," he admitted, "if we should have been braver sooner. But then I think about what we built together, the friendship, the cafe, the life we share, and I can't regret the path that got us here." Marcus was smiling now, that satisfied expression of someone who'd gotten exactly the emotional content they were looking for. "That's perfect. The viewers are going to love this." Perfect. Right. Because it sounded like a love story instead of a confession of 10 years of cowardice disguised as caution. 10 years of wanting someone and being too afraid to risk losing them. The interview wrapped. Matteo stood, his legs unsteady, and found Elara waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and fear, and maybe, possibly, recognition. "How was it?" she asked. "I told the truth." He shrugged, trying for casual and landing somewhere near desperate. "Mostly. Did you?" "Mostly." She bit her lip, a tell he'd learned to read years ago. She was about to say something difficult. "Matteo, we need to talk about—" "Actually," Marcus interrupted, appearing with his tablet and his relentless enthusiasm, "we're going to pause here for today, give you two some time to yourselves before dinner service. But tomorrow morning, we want to film something special. A date. Just the two of you, away from the cafe, being a couple out in the world. A date. A real date. Or as real as anything they'd been doing could claim to be." "Where?" Elara's voice was flat, resigned. "There's this beautiful park a few blocks away. We checked the weather. Rain's supposed to let up for a few hours tomorrow. We'll film you walking, talking, being in love." He said it like it was simple, like they weren't barely holding themselves together as it was. "The viewers need to see you outside your comfort zone. See how the relationship works in the real world." The real world, where they were just friends, where they had separate lives and carefully maintained boundaries, and a decade of practiced distance that this documentary was systematically dismantling. "Sounds great," Matteo lied, because what else could he say? After Marcus left, after the crew packed up and headed out for the night, they stood in the cafe surrounded by the day's wreckage. Dirty cups, crumb-covered tables, the lingering smell of espresso and lies. "We need to talk," Elara said again. "I know." But Matteo didn't move, didn't start the conversation that would force them to acknowledge what was happening between them. "Tomorrow, after the date, we'll figure this out." "Will we?" She looked at him with those hazel eyes that had undone him from the very beginning. "Because I'm not sure I know how to find our way back from this." Neither did he. That was the terrifying part. They'd crossed too many lines, blurred too many boundaries, let too much truth slip through. And with each passing hour, the idea of going back to before, to just friends, just partners, just the carefully maintained fiction of platonic love, felt less like a goal and more like a loss he couldn't bear to face. The park was different without rain. Autumn leaves scattered across paths that wound between ancient oaks, their branches creating cathedral ceilings of amber and gold. Morning light filtered through, soft and forgiving, turning everything nostalgic. It was the kind of day that belonged in a romance novel, designed specifically for falling in love, or pretending to. Elara walked beside Matteo with a cameraman following 10 feet behind, far enough to be unobtrusive, but close enough to catch every word, every look, every moment of manufactured intimacy. They'd been given instructions. Just be yourselves, talk about anything. Let us see the real you, the real them. If Marcus only knew how complicated that request was. "This is weird," Matteo said quietly, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets. "Being filmed, just walking. Everything about the last 3 days has been weird." She pulled her cardigan tighter against the morning chill. Yesterday I woke up in your arms. That was weird. Was it? His voice carried an edge she couldn't quite identify. Because it felt… Don't. She cut him off before he could finish the thought. We said we'd talk after this, after the cameras are gone. They're always there now. Even when the crew goes home, they're still there. In our heads. In the way we can't stop performing for an audience that isn't watching anymore. He wasn't wrong. Last night, after everyone had left, they'd moved around the flat with the same careful choreography they demonstrated for the cameras. He'd made dinner while she cleaned. They'd traded the bathroom with practiced ease. And when they'd climbed into bed, that too small bed that forced proximity, she'd been acutely aware of the space between them. The charged, heavy space that seemed to shrink with each breath. Tell me something true, Matteo said suddenly. Something that has nothing to do with the show or the cafe or any of this. Just something real. Elara looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the vulnerability he usually hid behind smiles and optimism. He was drowning too, just trying to keep his head above water while pretending everything was fine. I'm terrified, she admitted, of what happens when this is over, of who we'll be when we stop pretending. What if we're better? He stopped walking, turned to face her fully. Behind him, the cameraman adjusted position but stayed quiet. What if all of this, the documentary, the lie, being forced to act like we're together, what if it just showed us something that was already there? Her heart was a drum in her chest, too loud, too fast. Matteo, I'm not saying we need to figure it out now. I'm just saying, maybe we stop being so afraid of the question. The question. The one they'd been dancing around for 3 days, for 3 years, for 10 years of friendship that had always felt like more, but never had permission to be. What if we stop pretending? I don't know how to not be afraid of this, she whispered. Everything we've built, the cafe, our friendship, our partnership, it all depends on staying on safe ground. What if we step off and it all falls apart? And what if it doesn't? He reached for her hand, laced their fingers together with a gentleness that made her want to cry. What if we're stronger together than we ever were apart? A jogger passed, disrupting the moment. The cameraman shifted again, probably getting closer to capture the emotion playing across her face. They were still performing, still on display. Every word, every touch, every revelation documented for public consumption. But underneath the performance, something real was happening. Had been happening since the moment Wright had mistaken them for married. Maybe longer, maybe always. Can I try something? Matteo asked, his voice low. What? Just trust me, please. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. One hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. And then he was kissing her. Not like that first time with an audience and a deadline, but slow, soft, like they had all the time in the world to learn each other. The cameras faded, the park faded. Everything faded except the taste of him, the warmth of him, the overwhelming rightness of this moment that was supposed to be fake, but felt more honest than anything in her entire life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matteo rested his forehead against hers. That, he said quietly, felt real. Tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me you felt it too. I felt it, she admitted, the words barely more than air. God, Matteo, I've felt it for so long I don't remember when it started. His eyes widened. What? But Marcus was approaching, tablet in hand, that satisfied smile firmly in place. That was perfect, exactly what we needed. The vulnerability, the honesty. This is going to be the centerpiece of the whole documentary. Right, the documentary, the show, the elaborate fiction they were constructing. Elara stepped back from Matteo, the space between them suddenly cold and vast, and tried to remember which parts were real and which parts were performance. The terrifying truth was that she couldn't tell the difference anymore. By the time they returned to the cafe for afternoon service, Matteo's hands were shaking. Not from fear or caffeine or lack of sleep, but from the force of trying to hold back words that had been clawing at his throat for years and were now desperate for escape. "I've felt it for so long, I don't remember when it started." Elara had said that. In the park, with cameras rolling, she'd admitted to feeling, what? Love? Want? The same impossible thing he'd been carrying around since that night outside the party, when she'd looked at him and said, "I knew you'd come." He burned his hand on the steam wand for the third time that afternoon. Cursed, ran it under cold water while Elara took over his station without comment, falling into the rhythm they'd perfected over years of partnership. "You okay?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the cafe noise. No, he wasn't okay. He was coming apart at the seams, held together only by the thinnest veneer of professional courtesy and sheer stubbornness. Because they'd opened something in that park that he didn't know how to close. Had maybe been opening since the moment they'd kissed in front of 50 strangers. Or maybe since they'd woken up tangled together. Or maybe since that first day in the library when she'd looked at him like he might be capable of saving her. "Fine," he lied. "Just tired." Liar. But she said it softly, almost fondly, and moved on to the next order without pressing. The afternoon blurred past in a haze of coffee and small talk, and cameras documenting everything. Marcus had been right. They did have chemistry. The kind that couldn't be faked or manufactured, that came from a decade of learning each other's rhythms and tells and unspoken languages. But now that chemistry had been transformed, made dangerous by acknowledgement. By 5 p.m., Matteo's control was fraying. He needed space. Air. Distance from Elara's coconut shampoo, and the memory of how she'd kissed him back like she'd been waiting for it. Like she'd wanted it just as desperately as he did. "I need to make a supply run," he announced to no one in particular. "Back in an hour." He didn't wait for responses, just grabbed his jacket and headed out into the London twilight, letting the cold air shock some sense back into his system. 3 days. They'd agreed to 3 days of this madness. Tomorrow was day 3. By tomorrow night, the documentary crew would pack up their equipment and leave them to figure out what remained. Whether they destroyed their friendship for a viral moment or discovered something that had been waiting all along. His phone buzzed. "Elara, where did you go?" Matteo leaned against a brick wall in an alley 3 blocks from the cafe, staring at the message. He could lie. Say he really was getting supplies. Maintain pretense that everything was fine, that he wasn't currently having a breakdown over feelings he'd suppressed for a decade. Or he could tell the truth. He typed, "I needed to not be near you for 5 minutes before I did something stupid." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Like what?" "Like tell you I'm in love with you in front of cameras and customers and everyone we know, and mean every word of it." Send. His heart stopped. The message sat there, delivered, read receipt showing, and then nothing. No response, no 3 dots, just silence stretching into minutes that felt like years. He'd done it, actually done it, confessed via text like a coward instead of waiting until they could talk privately, like an adult, like someone who deserved the friendship he just potentially destroyed. His phone rang. Elara's name flashed across the screen. "Before you say anything," he started, but she cut him off. "Where are you, exactly? Tell me where you are right now." He gave her the cross streets, still leaning against the wall because standing upright felt like too much effort. "Stay there. Don't move. I'm coming to you." The line went dead. Matteo closed his eyes, tilted his head back against brick, and tried to prepare himself for whatever came next. For her gentle letdown, her careful explanation of why they couldn't do this, her reasonable arguments about protecting what they'd built. 10 minutes later, footsteps echoed in the alley. He opened his eyes to find Elara standing 5 feet away, breathing hard like she'd run the whole distance, her eyes wild and her hair coming loose from its bun. "You can't just," she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "You can't just say that and then not be there. That's not fair, that's—" "I'm sorry." He pushed off the wall, hands up in surrender. "I know. I shouldn't have texted it. I should have waited. But Elara, I can't keep pretending. Not anymore." 3 days of acting like we're together showed me exactly how much I want it to be real. And I can't— She kissed him, crossed the distance in 2 strides, and kissed him with a desperation that rivaled the park. Rivaled that first kiss at 11 a.m. Rivaled every fantasy he'd ever had about this moment. When they broke apart, she was crying. "You're an idiot." "I know. I've been in love with you since the night you picked me up from that party, maybe before, and I've spent 10 years convincing myself I was protecting our friendship, when really I was just too afraid to risk being hurt again." Matteo cupped her face in his hands, thumbs wiping away tears. "You're not going to be hurt. Not by me, never by me." "You can't promise that." "I can try." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corners of her mouth. "For the rest of my life, if you let me, I can try." She laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "We're doing this? Really doing this? Not for cameras or documentaries or saving the cafe, but because we actually want to?" "I want to," he confirmed. "God, Elara, I've wanted to for so long. I want morning coffee and shared blankets and waking up with you in my arms. I want fights about menu items and late nights planning and everything we've already been doing, but with the permission to call it what it actually is." Which is? Love. The word came out reverent, like a prayer. Actual, terrifying, all-in love. She kissed him again, softer this time, sweet and promising. "Okay. Okay? Let's be terrified together. Let's burn it all down or build something amazing. Let's stop pretending this is anything other than what it's always been." Matteo pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and felt something in his chest unlock. 10 years of careful distance, 3 days of forced intimacy, and finally, the truth they'd both been too afraid to speak. They stayed like that for long minutes, holding each other in a London alley while the city moved around them, until Elara's phone started ringing. "It's Marcus," she said, checking the screen. "We've been gone almost an hour. The crew is probably—" "Let them wait." Matteo caught her hand as she moved to answer. 5 more minutes. Just us. Before we go back to the cameras in the cafe and figuring out how to tell everyone we accidentally fell in love while pretending to be married. She laughed, genuine and bright, and silenced her phone. 5 more minutes. They stretched into 10, into 20, into the kind of stolen time that lovers take when they're new and brave and absolutely certain they found something worth protecting. When they finally walked back to the daily grind, hands laced together and secret smiles playing at their lips, they found Marcus waiting outside with an expression caught between exasperation and delight. "Where have you two been? We've been trying to reach you for—" He stopped, really looking at them. At their joined hands, their matching expressions, the shift in energy that was probably visible from space. Oh, something happened." "Yeah," Elara said simply. "Something happened." Marcus's grin could have powered the entire cafe. "Please tell me we can film this. The real love story behind the fake one? This is gold. This is better than gold. This is—" "Private," Matteo interrupted gently but firmly. "This is private. What happens next? Figuring out us, navigating the transition from friends to more. That's ours, not for the cameras." For a moment, he thought Marcus might argue, might push for access to this new chapter, this evolution they'd stumbled into while performing for an audience. But the producer just nodded, understanding written across his face. "Fair enough. We've got enough footage anyway. The documentary basically writes itself now. He checked his watch. We'll do a wrap-up interview tomorrow morning, get your final thoughts, and then we're out of your hair. Sound good? Sounds perfect, Elara said, squeezing Matteo's hand. They reopened the cafe for evening service, moved through their choreography with new awareness, new permission for every touch and glance. And when closing time came, when they climbed the stairs to the flat that had become their shared space through necessity and deception, they did so knowing it wouldn't be the last time, that this temporary arrangement had transformed into something permanent, that sometimes the best love stories start with lies and end with truth. The flat felt different that night, smaller somehow, but in a way that felt cozy rather than claustrophobic. Elara stood by the window, looking out at the rain-slicked street, because of course it was raining again, because London, while Matteo made tea on the temperamental hot plate. We should talk logistics, she said, watching his reflection in the glass. Where we go from here? Practical things. Practical things. He set down 2 mugs, moved to stand behind her. Like whether you're moving in here permanently or if we're getting a real flat. Together. Together. The words still felt new in her mouth, weighted with promise and terror in equal measure. We should probably start with telling people the truth, that we weren't actually married, that the documentary was built on a lie. Or we tell them a different truth. His arms came around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. That we were friends who didn't realize we were in love until we had to pretend to be. That sometimes you have to act like you're something before you can admit you want to be it. She turned in his embrace, looking up at his face in the dim light. You're okay with that? With everyone knowing we lied? I'm okay with everyone knowing we found each other. He kissed her forehead. However messy the path was. The tea went cold while they stood there, wrapped around each other, making plans and promises and adjustments to a future that suddenly looked completely different than it had a week ago. They argued about moving logistics. Her flat was bigger, but his had better light. Debated whether to tell Mrs. Chen first or let her figure it out on her own. She probably already knew. Discussed how to handle the documentary reveal. Together, always together. And when they finally climbed into bed, their bed now, by choice rather than necessity, Elara felt something settle in her chest. Something that felt like coming home. Hey, Matteo said in the darkness, his hand finding hers under the covers. Thank you. For what? For being brave enough to let this happen. For not running when it got scary. For choosing us even though it meant risking everything. She squeezed his hand. We're going to be okay, right? Even when the documentary airs and people realize we lied. Even when we have to navigate being together while running a business. Even when it gets hard. We'll figure it out? We'll figure it out, he promised. We always do. Outside, rain continued its steady drumbeat. Inside, wrapped in warmth and each other, they fell asleep not as best friends pretending to be more, but as lovers who'd finally stopped pretending to be less. Morning arrived too early, bringing with it the final day of filming and the wrap-up interview Marcus had promised. They dressed in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the ease of long practice, but now with added grace notes. A hand on the small of her back, a kiss pressed to his shoulder, small touches that were theirs and theirs alone. Ready? Matteo asked as they headed downstairs to face the cameras one last time. As I'll ever be. Marcus had set up in the corner where they'd done the individual interviews, but this time there was only one chair. We're doing this together, he explained, a joint reflection on the experience. Just wrap up the story we've been telling. They sat close enough that their shoulders touched, Matteo's hand finding Elara's automatically. The cameras rolled. So, Marcus started, his expression knowing, a lot has happened in 3 days. Walk me through it. How are you feeling? Elara and Matteo exchanged a look. A whole conversation happened in that glance. How much to reveal, how honest to be, which truths were for public consumption and which were private treasures to protect. Grateful, Elara said finally. This whole experience, the article, the attention, the documentary, it saved our cafe. But more than that, it gave us permission to stop hiding behind what we thought we should be and accept what we actually are. Which is? In love, Matteo said simply. Not pretend in love for the cameras, actually in love. The kind that was there all along, just waiting for us to be brave enough to acknowledge it. Marcus beamed. So the documentary caught you falling in love? The documentary caught us admitting it, Elara corrected. But the falling happened a long time ago. We just weren't paying attention. They talked for another 30 minutes, answering questions about the cafe's future, their relationship plans, what they'd learned from having cameras document their daily lives. And through it all, they held hands, stole glances, smiled secret smiles that spoke of inside jokes, and shared history and a future they were finally letting themselves imagine. When Marcus finally called cut, when the camera stopped rolling and the crew began packing up equipment, Elara felt something release in her chest. The performance was over. The documentary had its ending, a better one than they'd planned, built on truth instead of fiction. One last question, Marcus said as he prepared to leave. Off the record this time. Was any of it real? The marriage story, the anniversary kiss, any of it? Matteo looked at Elara. Elara looked at Matteo, and together they answered, all of it, in the ways that mattered. 2 weeks after the documentary aired, the Daily Grind was so busy they had to hire additional staff. 3 weeks after, they were featured in international food blogs. 1 month after, they'd paid off all their back rent and had enough saved to actually fix the temperamental espresso machine. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, with autumn giving way to winter and the cafe humming with satisfied customers, a familiar face appeared at the door. Alexander Wright, the food critic who'd started it all, stepped inside with his black umbrella and expensive wool coat. Elara's heart dropped. This was it, the moment Wright discovered their deception, the inevitable collapse of the house of cards they'd built. Mr. Wright, Matteo said carefully, appearing at her side in that way he had, of always knowing when she needed backup. We weren't expecting you. I know. Wright approached the counter, his expression unreadable. I wanted to see for myself. After the documentary aired, after the truth came out about your unconventional beginning, I had some questions. We can explain, Elara started, but Wright held up a hand. No need. I'm not here to retract my review or expose anything. I'm here because... He paused, and for the first time since they'd met him, Wright smiled, genuinely smiled. I'm here because you two proved something important. That sometimes the best love stories start with pretending. That sometimes you need permission, even fake permission, to become who you were always meant to be. You're not angry? Elara asked, unable to keep the shock from her voice. We lied to you, built a whole relationship on a misunderstanding. You built a relationship on 10 years of friendship and partnership and choosing each other every single day. The marriage paperwork was irrelevant. Wright glanced around the bustling cafe, at the customers laughing and connecting and experiencing the warmth Matteo and Elara had created. This place works because you two work. That's what I wrote about. That's what people responded to. The love was always real, even when the legal status wasn't. He ordered a coffee, the special, the one for anniversaries, and sat at a corner table, watching them move behind the counter with the synchronization of long practice and new intimacy. And when he left an hour later, he stopped at the door one last time. For what it's worth, Wright said, I'm glad you found each other, however messy the path was. The door closed. The bell chimed. Elara leaned against Matteo, letting his solid presence ground her. We did it, she said quietly. Actually did it. Saved the cafe, fell in love, survived the documentary reveal. We did it. We did. He kissed the top of her head. And now we get to do the rest. The boring parts and the beautiful parts and everything in between. The rest of our lives? If you'll have me. She turned in his arms, looked up at the man who'd picked her up at 2 a.m. and made terrible coffee, and believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. The man who'd agreed to a crazy scheme to save their dream and somehow turned it into a different dream entirely. "I'll have you," she said. "Every morning, every crisis, every perfectly imperfect moment. I'll have you." And there, in the cafe they'd built together, surrounded by the warm glow of string lights and the smell of fresh espresso and the sound of rain on windows, they kissed, not for cameras or critics or audiences, but for themselves, because they were finally, truly, honestly in love. And that was the only truth that mattered. 3 months after the documentary aired, Elara woke up in Matteo's actual flat, the one with better light, the one they'd chosen together, and felt the unfamiliar weight of contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. His arm was slung across her waist, his breath steady against her neck, and for once, her mind wasn't racing through worst-case scenarios or contingency plans. They'd done it, actually done it, turned a desperate lie into something real. The cafe was thriving. They'd hired 2 part-time baristas and a weekend baker, paid off every outstanding debt, even replaced the temperamental espresso machine with one that didn't require prayer and profanity to function. The documentary had brought them financial stability, media attention, and thousands of new customers who came for the love story and stayed for the coffee. But lying in bed beside Matteo, feeling his heartbeat against her back, Elara knew the real miracle wasn't the cafe's success. It was this: waking up beside someone who'd seen her at her worst and chosen her anyway, who knew every anxious spiral and defensive mechanism and loved her not despite them, but including them. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from Mrs. Chen. "Saw you two on the morning show. Very sweet. Also, I always knew. You're not as subtle as you think." Elara smiled, careful not to disturb Matteo. They'd gone public with their relationship, or rather, corrected the public record, 2 weeks after the documentary wrapped. Posted a joint statement explaining that they hadn't been married when Wright interviewed them, that the lie had started as a misunderstanding and snowballed into something they couldn't control. The response had been overwhelming. Some people felt betrayed, called them frauds and opportunists, accused them of manipulating viewers' emotions for profit. But far more people understood, celebrated them, shared their own stories of friendships that became more, of love that needed permission to exist, of taking the scenic route to happy endings. "You're thinking too loud," Matteo mumbled against her shoulder, his voice sleep-rough and impossibly sexy. "I can hear your brain from here." "Just reading texts. Mrs. Chen says she always knew." Everyone always knew. He tightened his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "We were the only ones who didn't." That wasn't entirely true. Elara had known, on some level, for years, had felt the pull toward him every time he laughed at her terrible jokes, or stayed up until 3 a.m. helping her debug spreadsheets, or looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in any room. She'd just been too afraid to name it, too convinced that wanting more would mean losing everything. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "How it happened? The lying, the cameras, all of it." Matteo shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could see her face. His hair was a disaster, sticking up in 17 directions, and his eyes were still heavy with sleep, but he'd never looked more perfect. "Not even a little bit. Do you?" "No." She reached up to smooth down his hair, gave up, let her hand rest against his cheek instead. "I just wonder sometimes if we would have figured it out without the push, without being forced to pretend. We would have." He said it with such certainty that she almost believed him. "Maybe not on our timeline, maybe not the way we wanted, but we would have gotten here eventually. We're inevitable, Elara. We always were." Inevitable. like coffee and morning, like rain in London, like 10 years of friendship that had been quietly, patiently waiting to become more. Her phone buzzed again, this time an unknown number. This is Alexander Wright. I'm writing a follow-up piece on couples from my original articles. Would you and Matteo be interested in an interview? No performance required, just honesty. Elara showed Matteo the screen. He read it, then looked at her with raised eyebrows. What do you think? I think we owe him the truth. The whole truth, not the version we perform for cameras. Then let's give it to him. Matteo kissed her forehead, her nose, finally her lips, soft and sweet and unhurried. But later. Right now I'm exactly where I want to be. Later stretched into an hour, into coffee in bed and stolen kisses, and the kind of lazy morning that felt like luxury after months of caffeine-fueled chaos. And when they finally made it to the daily grind, late, rumpled, completely unrepentant, they found a small crowd already gathered outside. "Here we go," Elara murmured, but she was smiling as she said it, because this was their life now. Not perfect, not without complications, but theirs. Built on a foundation of lies that had cracked open to reveal truth underneath. And that was worth every awkward interview, every invasive question, every moment of vulnerability they'd been forced to endure. The interview with Wright was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, during the cafe's usual slow period. But when Thursday arrived, Elara found herself pacing the length of their flat, unable to sit still, unable to stop the anxious spiral that kept asking, what if telling the complete truth destroyed what they'd built? "He already knows we lied," Matteo pointed out, watching her wear a path in their hardwood floor. "The documentary made that pretty clear. This is just elaboration. This is confession." She stopped pacing long enough to meet his eyes. "About how we manipulated the situation. About how calculated some of it was. What if people stop seeing us as this romantic story and start seeing us as con artists? Then they see us as we actually were." He stood, crossed to her, caught her restless hands in his steady ones. "Desperate people trying to save something we loved. That's not a con, that's just being human. You're very calm about this. One of us has to be." He smiled, soft and reassuring. "Besides, I'm not worried. We've already survived the worst of it. The cameras, the documentary reveal, learning how to be together instead of just friends. An interview is nothing." But when they arrived at the cafe and found Wright already there, notebook open and pen ready, Elara felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. This was it. The moment they stopped performing and started being honest. No filters, no edits, just them. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Wright said, gesturing to the chairs they'd set up in their usual corner. "I promise, this is about understanding, not judgment. I'm curious about the journey, how you went from business partners to this." He gestured between them, their linked hands, their matched body language, the visible comfort of people who knew each other's rhythms. They sat. Matteo kept hold of her hand, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in the pattern that always calmed her. And then for the next 2 hours, they told the story. The real story. How they'd met at university over terrible coffee and economics homework. How friendship had deepened into something neither of them knew how to name. How they'd opened the cafe as partners and watched their dreams slowly suffocate under debt. How Wright's misunderstanding had felt like a lifeline they couldn't afford to refuse. "We made a choice," Elara said carefully, "to let you believe something that wasn't true. And then we made another choice, to keep lying when we should have corrected you. I'm not proud of that, but I also can't regret it because it saved the cafe and forced us to confront feelings we'd been ignoring for years." "So the documentary caught something real," Wright said, pen moving across paper. "Even though the premise was false." "The premise was always real," Matteo corrected gently. "We were partners. We did build this place together. We just hadn't admitted we were in love yet. The documentary gave us permission to stop pretending we weren't." Wright looked up from his notes, his expression thoughtful. That's an interesting distinction. So you're saying the performance revealed truth rather than obscuring it? Yes. They said it together, then laughed. That synchronized response that came from knowing someone completely. The interview continued. Questions about how they navigated the relationship now, how business partnership had evolved into romantic partnership, what advice they'd give to others in similar situations. And through it all, they were honest, sometimes painfully so, about the fights they'd had during the documentary, about the fears they still carried, about how loving your best friend was the most terrifying and rewarding thing either of them had ever done. When Wright finally packed up his notebook and prepared to leave, he paused at the door. You know, I've interviewed hundreds of couples over the years. Most of them perform even when the cameras are off. But you two, even when you were lying about being married, you were telling the truth about everything else. The partnership, the respect, the care. That's what people responded to. Not the marriage certificate you didn't have, but the relationship you did. After he left, Elara leaned against Matteo, suddenly exhausted. That was harder than I expected. But good, he said. Right? Good to finally tell the whole truth? Yeah. She tilted her head up to look at him. Good. Wright's follow-up article published 2 weeks later under the headline, The Daily Grind Revisited, When Fake It Till You Make It Becomes Real Love. Elara read it on her phone during the morning rush, Matteo reading over her shoulder, both of them holding their breath as they scrolled through Wright's words. He'd been kind. More than kind, he'd been understanding. Wrote about their journey with nuance and empathy, contextualizing their initial lie within the broader reality of small business struggles and the human tendency to grab at hope, however it presents itself. But he'd also been honest about the ethical questions their story raised, the ways they'd manipulated perception, the fact that their success had been built partially on deception. The comments section was predictably divided. Still love them. Everyone makes mistakes. This is fraud. They should be ashamed. The real love story is better than the fake one. Thanks for the honesty. Can't trust anything anymore. Disappointed. Matteo set down his phone and reached for Elara's hand across the counter. Hey, look at me. She did, though her eyes were stinging with unshed tears. What if this ruins everything? What if people stop coming? What if... Then we rebuild. Again. Like we always do. His voice was steady, certain. We survived being broke. We survived the documentary. We'll survive this too. Together. The cafe door opened. Mrs. Chen walked in, took one look at their faces and sighed. Read the article, did you? Yes, Elara admitted. Good. It's honest. Better than the puff piece he wrote before. She settled into her usual corner table. Now stop looking so tragic and make me a chamomile tea. Some of us have crossword puzzles to finish. And just like that, the morning continued. Customers came in, some of them mentioning the article, most not. A few left reviews online supporting them. A few left reviews condemning them. But the daily grind kept serving coffee, kept filling seats, kept being exactly what it had always been. A warm, welcoming space where people could escape London's gray weather and find comfort in perfectly crafted drinks and the quiet love story unfolding behind the counter. By noon, Elara started breathing easier. By closing time, she'd stop checking her phone every 5 minutes. And when they climbed the stairs to their flat that night, their actual flat, the one they'd chosen and furnished together, she finally let herself believe what Matteo had been saying all along. They were going to be okay. 6 months after the documentary aired, on a Tuesday that started like any other, Elara's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Probably another journalist looking for a statement, another blogger wanting an interview. But something made her pick up. Is this Elara? A woman's voice, nervous and young. From the Daily Grind? Yes. Who's this? My name is Sophie. I saw the documentary. And the follow-up article, and I need advice. I'm in love with my best friend, and I don't know what to do. Elara's first instinct was to hang up, to establish boundaries between her public story and her private life. But she heard the desperation in Sophie's voice, the fear, the hope. She remembered being there herself not so long ago. Okay, Elara said, gesturing to Matteo that she needed to step outside. Tell me about it. Sophie talked for 20 minutes, about a friendship that had lasted since childhood, about feelings that had been building for years, about the terror of risking everything for something that might not work. And Elara listened, offering what wisdom she'd gained from her own messy journey, trying to be honest about how hard it was and how worth it. But what if I lose them? Sophie asked, voice breaking. What if I tell them and everything changes? It will change, Elara said gently. Either way, it changes. But at least if you tell them, you give it a chance to change into something better. That's all any of us can do. Be brave enough to let things evolve. After Sophie hung up, Elara stood outside the cafe for a long moment, watching rain streak down the windows, thinking about unintended consequences. They'd told their story publicly, first the lie, then the truth, and now it belonged to everyone. People saw themselves in it, projected their own hopes and fears onto it, used it as a mirror or a map. That was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Matteo appeared beside her, wordlessly handing her a jacket. Another one? Another one. She'd lost count of how many people had reached out over the past months. Some wanting advice, some wanting to share their own stories, some just wanting to say thank you for being honest about the messy parts. A woman in love with her best friend. What did you tell her? To be brave, to take the risk, to trust that the right person won't run. She looked up at him, at the man who'd proven that trust wasn't misplaced. Was that the right advice? It was the honest advice. He pulled her close, sheltering her from the rain with his body. That's all we can offer, honesty. The rest is up to them. They stood there in the London drizzle, wrapped around each other, and Elara thought about all the ways their story had expanded beyond them. How the documentary had captured something raw and real that resonated with people who'd never set foot in their cafe. How their willingness to admit mistakes had given others permission to be imperfect. Maybe that was the real gift they'd given. Not a perfect love story, but an honest one, messy and complicated and real. 1 year after the documentary aired, the Daily Grind celebrated its anniversary with a party that spilled out onto the street despite the inevitable rain. Customers past and present crowded into the cafe, along with neighbors and friends, and even a few journalists who'd covered their story. Mrs. Chen held court in her corner, telling anyone who'd listened that she'd known they were in love from day one. She did not, Elara whispered to Matteo as they navigated through the crowd, refilling drinks and accepting congratulations. She absolutely did, Matteo whispered back. You're the only one who was oblivious. Excuse me, you were equally oblivious. I was pining, there's a difference. They were still playfully bickering when Marcus appeared, camera in hand, that familiar, enthusiastic grin on his face. Mind if I get a few shots? For a Where Are They Now segment? Elara and Matteo exchanged a look. They'd been wary of cameras since the documentary wrapped, protective of the private space they'd carved out for their actual relationship. But this felt different. This wasn't about performance or manufactured intimacy. This was just documentation of something real. Sure, Elara said, but only if you promise. No staging, no scripts, no asking you to recreate moments. Marcus held up his hands in surrender. Just you two being you, that's what worked the first time. He filmed them working behind the counter, the easy rhythm they'd maintained through everything. Captured them laughing with customers, stealing quick kisses between orders, moving through their space with the practiced choreography of people who knew each other's patterns. And when he finally lowered the camera, he looked almost emotional. You know what's different now? Marcus asked. Last year you were performing love. Tonight you're just living it. That's the real story. After the party wound down, after the last guests had left, and they'd cleaned the cafe and climbed the stairs to the flat above, the one they still kept for late nights, though they mostly lived in Matteo's place now, Elara stood at the window looking down at the street below. "Penny for your thoughts," Matteo said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Just thinking about how much has changed, how different everything looks from here. Better different or worse different? Better." She turned in his embrace, studying his face in the dim light. "So much better, even with the complications and the criticism and all the messy parts. This, us, it's the best thing I've ever done. Even though it started with a lie? Especially because it started with a lie." She stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, soft and slow. "Because the lie forced us to stop lying to ourselves about what we wanted. Sometimes you need the wrong beginning to get to the right ending." They stayed at the window, watching rain fall on the street below, on the cafe that had brought them together, in the city that had witnessed their evolution, from friends to partners to something more. And Elara thought about all the versions of herself she'd been over the past year. The desperate business owner, the reluctant performer, the woman brave enough to choose love, and felt grateful for all of them. Because they'd all been necessary to become who she was now. Someone who'd learned that the best stories weren't the perfect ones, but the honest ones. That love wasn't about having all the answers, but about being willing to ask the hard questions. That sometimes the biggest risk was refusing to take one. 18 months after the documentary aired, Matteo stood in the middle of the daily grind at 5 a.m., before opening, and tried to calm the nervous energy thrumming through his veins. In his pocket was a ring, simple, elegant, exactly Elara's style, and a plan that was either romantic or ridiculous, depending on how the next few hours went. He'd been carrying the ring for 3 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. The problem was that every moment with Elara felt perfect in its own way. Morning coffee and crossword puzzles, late-night conversations about menu updates and life updates in equal measure. The way she fit against him when they slept, her cold feet finding his warm legs, her hair tickling his nose. But he wanted something special, something that honored where they'd started and where they'd ended up, something that felt true to them. So he'd planned this. Elara arrived at 5:30, exactly on schedule, her key turning in the lock. She stopped short when she saw the cafe, not as she'd left it last night, but transformed. Fairy lights wrapped around every surface, creating a warm glow that pushed back the pre-dawn darkness. Candles on every table. And in the center of the counter, a single cup of coffee with foam art that had taken him 45 minutes to perfect. 2 intertwined hearts. "Matteo?" Her voice was uncertain, confused. "What is this?" "A do-over." He came around the counter to stand in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Remember the night we set up the rules? About keeping it professional, only acting when there's an audience, protecting the friendship above everything?" "I remember. We broke all those rules, every single one. And I'm glad we did, because they were terrible rules based on fear and self-protection. But I want to make new rules, better ones, rules that start from honesty instead of fear." Her eyes were shining now, tears threatening to spill over. "What kind of rules?" "Rule 1, no more pretending. Not for cameras, not for critics, not for anyone. Just us, being honest about what we want." "And what do you want?" Instead of answering with words, Matteo pulled the ring from his pocket, watched Elara's eyes widen, her breath catch, her hand come up to cover her mouth. "I want to marry you," he said simply, "for real this time. Not because a food critic assumes it, not because a documentary needs a happy ending, but because I love you, and I want to spend my life waking up beside you and making terrible coffee puns and growing old together. I want to make it legal and permanent and real. So this is rule 2. We stop pretending we're married and actually do it. If you want. No pressure, no performance. Just a question from someone who loves you to someone he hopes feels the same way. For a moment, Elara just stared at him, and Matteo's heart started to sink, started to spiral into panic that he'd misread everything, that she wasn't ready, that he'd pushed too hard too fast. Then she laughed, watery and joyful and completely genuine. You absolute idiot, yes, yes, of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that only shook a little, then pulled her close and kissed her properly. Not for cameras, not for an audience, just for them. There's a rule 3, he murmured against her lips. Want to hear it? Always. Rule 3, whatever comes next, good or bad, easy or hard, with cameras or without, we face it together. No more going it alone. No more protecting each other by keeping distance. We're all in. All in, she echoed, and kissed him again. They stayed like that as dawn broke over London, wrapped around each other in the café that had started as a business venture and become the foundation of their love story. And when Mrs. Chen arrived early for her usual morning tea, she took one look at them and snorted. Finally, about time you made it official. I was wondering how long you'd drag out the engagement. We just got engaged, Elara said, holding up her hand to show off the ring. Exactly, dragging it out. But Mrs. Chen was smiling as she said it, soft and genuine. Congratulations. Now open up. Some of us need caffeine. The wedding was small, intimate, nothing like the elaborate affair they'd pretended to have had, and perfect because of it. They held it in the daily grind on a Tuesday evening after closing, surrounded by fairy lights and the smell of fresh espresso and the people who'd been there for the whole messy journey. Mrs. Chen stood as Elara's witness. A culinary school friend of Matteo's stood as his. Marcus filmed the ceremony with permission, but promised the footage was just for them. No public broadcast, no documentary sequel, just a record of the moment for their own keeping. Elara wore a simple cream dress she'd found at a vintage shop in Shoreditch. Matteo wore a suit he'd owned for years, but never had reason to put on. And when they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, there wasn't a dry eye in the cafe. I promise to always tell you the truth, Elara said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Even when it's hard, even when I'm scared, even when the truth is that I'm terrified of losing you, but more terrified of not choosing you every single day. I promise to see you, Matteo said, his own eyes wet. Really see you. The brilliant marketing mind and the anxious spiral, and the way you scrunch your nose when you're concentrating. All of it, forever, no matter what. They sealed it with a kiss, their first kiss as actual spouses, not pretend ones, and the small gathering erupted in applause. Alexander Wright, who'd been invited as an honored guest, raised his glass for a toast. To Elara and Matteo, who taught us all that sometimes the best love stories start with a misunderstanding and end with the truth. May your marriage be filled with excellent coffee, honest conversations, and only the occasional lie, the kind that protects surprise parties, not the kind that protects hearts. They cut a cake that Matteo had made himself, secretly, over 3 sleepless nights, danced to music from Elara's carefully curated playlist, and when the evening wound down and the guests filtered out into the London night, they stood alone in the cafe that had witnessed their entire evolution. So, Matteo said, pulling her close, how does it feel to be actually married to me instead of just pretending? Exactly the same, Elara admitted, and completely different. Is that weird? No. He rested his forehead against hers. It's perfect. We're perfect. This messy, complicated, honest thing we've built, it's perfect. Outside, rain began to fall. Inside, wrapped in string lights and each other, they swayed to music only they could hear. 2 years after the documentary aired, On a random Wednesday afternoon during the post-lunch lull, a young couple walked into the daily grind, holding hands and looking nervous. "Can we help you?" Elara asked from behind the counter, where she was working on inventory while Matteo tested a new pastry recipe. "We saw the documentary," the young woman said, "in the follow-up article, and we just got engaged and we wanted to see it for ourselves, the place where the love story happened." Elara and Matteo exchanged a look. This happened occasionally, people making pilgrimages to their cafe like it was a shrine to romance rather than a small business trying to stay afloat. It was flattering and bizarre in equal measure. "Congratulations," Matteo said, wiping flour from his hands. "Can I make you our special? The one for anniversaries?" "Actually," the young man said, "we were hoping you could give us advice. We're getting married in 6 months, and everyone keeps telling us it's going to ruin our friendship. That being in love with your best friend is a recipe for disaster." Elara came around the counter, studied these two young people who reminded her so much of herself and Matteo years ago, full of hope and terror, standing on the edge of something that could be either wonderful or catastrophic. "Here's what I wish someone had told me," she said carefully. "Marrying your best friend is the hardest and best thing you'll ever do, because you can't hide behind the polite distance of normal relationships. They know all your terrible habits and worst qualities, and they're choosing you anyway. That's terrifying. But it also means you get to build something real, not a performance of love, but the actual messy, complicated, everyday thing." "Does it get easier?" the young woman asked. "No," Matteo said, joining them with 4 cups of coffee, the special, the one he'd perfected over years of practice. "It gets realer. You learn to fight fair and forgive quickly and communicate even when you'd rather just retreat. But if you're both willing to do the work, if you're both all in, then you get something most people never find. A partner who's also your best friend, who sees you completely and loves you anyway." The couple stayed for 2 hours, asking questions and drinking coffee, and gradually relaxing into the possibility that maybe marrying their best friend wouldn't destroy everything. When they finally left, they looked lighter, hopeful. "We're like relationship therapists now," Elara observed, leaning against Matteo. "How did that happen?" "We told the truth about our mess, and it gave other people permission to embrace theirs." He kissed the top of her head. "There are worse legacies." That evening, after they'd closed the cafe and were walking home through London streets slick with rain, Ilara's phone buzzed. A text from Sophie, the woman who'd called months ago asking for advice. "I told them. They feel the same way. We're together now. Thank you for being brave enough to share your story." Elara showed Matteo the message. He smiled, soft and genuine, and pulled her closer. "See, we're helping. Or we're just lucky. Both. We're both." 3 years after the documentary aired, Marcus called with a proposal. "I know you two are done with cameras," he started, "but hear me out. I want to do a retrospective. 3 years later, checking in with all the couples from my Love Brewing series. Just an hour-long special, very low-key." Elara and Matteo, curled together on their couch with competing laptops and shared blankets, looked at each other over the video call. "What would it involve?" Matteo asked. "Just an interview. Talking about where you are now, what's changed, what you've learned. Maybe some updated footage of the cafe. That's it. I promise, no manufactured drama, no digging into private stuff, just where are you now versus where you were then." They took 3 days to discuss it, weighed the pros, closure, controlling their narrative, helping fund the cafe expansion they'd been planning, against the cons, invasion of privacy, dredging up old criticism, opening themselves to new scrutiny. In the end, it came down to one question. Did they trust themselves to be honest without being vulnerable in ways they'd regret? The answer was yes, so they agreed. Let Marcus and a minimal crew back into their lives for one final chapter. And when filming day arrived, they felt calmer than they'd expected. Because this time, they weren't performing. They were just being themselves. "Tell me about the last 3 years," Marcus said, his camera trained on them sitting side by side in their usual corner of the cafe. Elara squeezed Matteo's hand and began. "We got married for real, expanded the cafe, hired a full staff, paid off every debt, learned how to fight fairly and love honestly, and build a life that's ours, not a performance of what we think life should look like." "Any regrets?" Marcus asked. "About how it all started?" "None," Matteo said firmly, "because the lie led to truth. The performance led to something real. We wouldn't be here without that journey, no matter how messy it was." They talked about the hard parts too, the criticism they'd faced, the way public perception had complicated their private relationship, the learning curve of being both business partners and life partners. But mostly they talked about the good parts, the morning coffees and evening walks and late-night conversations. The way knowing someone completely made you braver, not more cautious. The fact that love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing each other every day, especially on the days when it was hard. When Marcus finally wrapped filming, he looked genuinely emotional. "You two are the real deal. You know that, right? Not because of the documentary or the love story, but because you did the work. You took the mess and turned it into something beautiful." After he left, Elara and Matteo stood in the cafe they'd saved, with a lie and sustained with truth, and looked at each other in the gathering twilight. "We did it," Elara said softly. "Actually did it. Built something real." "We did," Matteo agreed, pulling her close. "And we're going to keep doing it, every day, for the rest of our lives." 5 years after the documentary aired, the daily grind was unrecognizable from the struggling cafe it had been. 2 locations now, the original and a second in East London. A line of packaged coffee beans sold in specialty shops across the UK. A cookbook co-authored by Matteo and Elara, featuring recipes and the honest story of how they'd built their business and their relationship simultaneously. But on this particular morning, Elara stood in the original cafe before opening, watching rain streak down windows that had witnessed so much of their journey, and felt the familiar weight of contentment settle over her. Matteo appeared beside her, 2 cups of coffee in hand, the special, the one they'd perfected together over years of practice and love. "Thinking about the documentary?" he asked, somehow always knowing where her mind went. "Thinking about everything. How different it all looks from here." "Better different?" "Best different." She took the coffee, let the familiar ritual ground her. "You know what I realized? We spent so long being afraid that falling in love would ruin our friendship. But the friendship didn't end when we fell in love. It just evolved into something bigger, something that could hold more. Like a really good espresso blend," Matteo said with a grin. "Multiple components working together to create something better than any single element alone." "Did you just compare our marriage to coffee?" "You knew who you were marrying," she laughed, genuine and bright, and kissed him properly. "I did. I absolutely did." The cafe door opened. Mrs. Chen walked in, still holding her crossword puzzle, still choosing her corner table, still pretending she hadn't been watching their love story unfold from the very beginning. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," they called in unison. "Morning, lovebirds. The usual?" "Always," Elara confirmed, already moving behind the counter with Matteo, falling into the rhythm they'd perfected over a decade of partnership. As they made Mrs. Chen's chamomile tea and prepared for opening, Elara thought about all the versions of this cafe she'd known. The struggling business that had nearly broken them. The viral sensation built on a lie. The honest establishment they'd rebuilt from truth. And this current iteration, thriving, stable, real. But mostly she thought about the journey that had brought them here. The desperate gamble that had forced them to be honest. The performance that had revealed truth. The lie that had cracked open to show love underneath. And she thought about how sometimes the best stories weren't the ones that went according to plan, but the ones that went completely sideways and ended up exactly where they needed to be. "Ready for the day?" Matteo asked, flipping the sign to "Open." "With you?" Elara laced her fingers through his. "Always." The door opened. Customers flowed in. The espresso machine hissed to life. And the daily grind began another day of serving excellent coffee and honest love to everyone who walked through its doors. Some stories started with lies. Theirs had. But it ended with truth. The kind you built one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of bravery at a time. And that, Elara thought as she pulled the first shot of espresso, as Matteo made the first foam art heart, as Mrs. Chen settled in with her crossword and the rain continued its steady London drumbeat. That was the only kind of story worth telling, the true one.